Frodo and Sam at the Amazon Distribution Center. Lunchtime, Mr. Frodo. Just a moment, Sam. Just a few more boxes and I'll be finished. Samwise Gamgee sighed and wrung his brownish but explicitly Caucasian hands together. The longer they tarried, the more he could feel that horrible eye watching him. Not even his old gaffer, as often as he'd caught Sam sneaking a midday nap in the potato patch, could hold a candle to the Amazon Distribution Center and its rigid accounting of his every idle second. Frodo, meanwhile, had other, more pressing concerns. His pelvis was starting to hurt. His piss bottle was already all the way full, and the contents therein turned the colour of old Adelbard Took's apple cider in the fall. Ach! What Frodo wouldn't give for a cup of the old Took's spiced apple cider and a good long book on the fen. Not that his bladder could accommodate it, mind you, just that he'd give anything for that wee taste of home. Frodo sighed and wiped the sweat from his pale alabaster brow. As it stood, he dared not trek the 40-odd feet to the bathroom and back, not in full view of that horrible roaming eye, and certainly not before he finished packing and scanning his remaining orders. Rings. People seemed to be ordering more and more rings. Was it wedding season? Graduation? Frodo was beginning to learn a real eye for jewelry from shipping out so many rings. Meanwhile, Boromir had died by what Martin said was an improperly secured pallet falling on his ivory white head, but which Sarah, the assistant floor manager, had disputed in an email as the consequence of improper footwear. Whatever the method, however it had happened, Boromir's death cast a pallor, nay, a pallet, unsecured, over the workday. The one thing that kept Frodo going, that lightened his spirit and leavened his bladder, was the promise of his performance review later that day. It had been 6 months since he and Sam had first started working at the Amazon Distribution Center, and in all that time, Frodo had never once missed a day of work. He had never been late, and he always made it a point to not just meet, but exceed his quotas. The raise was as good as his, and while a quarter might not seem much to a king, to an assistant floor manager, to a hobbit, a quarter was half of a dollar, was the makings of a fortune. There, done. Frodo smiled as he put the finishing touch on his final order and set it on the conveyor belt towards Darnell. To the bathroom, then to lunch. Sam shook his beige as in tanned head. Boy, I don't know how you do it, Mr. Frodo, not going to the bathroom for so long. Frodo came from around his workstation onto the bustling warehouse floor. He could walk past the eye with his head held high, confident in a job well done. Oh, Sam, my dear, dear Sam. Sam couldn't stand to see his master walking so, holding out the ache in his pelvis. I would do your pissing for you if I could, Mr. Frodo. Honest I would. Oh, Sam, said Frodo, my dear, dear Sam. In back of the warehouse, beside the dumpster for all the cardboard, Sam and Frodo took their luncheon on a pair of overturned milk crates. There was lembas in the vending machine now, and while it may not have tasted quite like the real thing, it was still filling and did the trick. The hobbits didn't say much while they ate. Lulled by the gentle hiss of the freeway stretched across a flat, clean landscape of weeds and gravel and train tracks. They'd heard the stories, of course, that once upon a time the place had been nothing more than trees and grass, an empty, frivolous sort of place. Boy, it's lucky, said Samwise Gamgee, ruminating over an especially pulpy bit of lembas. It's lucky there's men like what built this place. Folks like me, they come across a green field or a babbling brook, and they see only that. They soak their toes and they move on. But the men like what built this place, they look at something like that and they see a canvas. They see all what it could be. Frodo nodded serenely. He smiled. Oh, Sam. In between bites of lembas, the hobbits vaped a savoury bit of old Toby, puffing out thick white clouds of the stuff overhead. It went a long way to taking the edge off. That was the thing, was you could never get too relaxed. In every languid puff of smoke or warm, diesel-twinged breeze from the freeway was the dark, sneaky ticking of the time clock. It was the same hour, wasn't it? Whether it be for a lunch break or for packing boxes? Then why did the one always seem so much shorter than the other? Just as Frodo felt himself begin to slip into despair, one of the delivery vans diverged from an incoming caravan of others and pulled up to where he and Sam were sitting. Merry cut the engine and clambered down from the driver's side, while Pippin stumbled out the back. "Hello, hello, hello!" cried Pippin. "Slouching about, are we?" "I'm back here where the old eye can't see you, eh?" said Merry. Frodo was startled a moment. There was something different about Merry and Pippin, but he couldn't quite put a finger on it. Had they grown taller, maybe? Had Merry gotten a haircut? "I tell you, gents." Pippin hunkered down beside Sam on the pavement and leaned back against the brick exterior of the warehouse. He spoke in between great, hurried vapes of his favourite long-bottom leaf. "I tell you what a day we had. Tell 'em, Merry, tell 'em the day we had." "Oh." Merry crouched and bent over his phone, pecking at it with his thumb in a secretive sort of way, like he was skulking about Farmer Maggot's turnips. "Had us driving all over. Andrew, bless him, called in sick with a monkeypox and we had to cover his route. Nasty business, them monkeypox. Wouldn't wish him on anyone." "Oh, aye," agreed Pippin. Good old Merry and Pippin. Already Frodo could feel his troubles melting away. He listened to them laugh and tell stories and poke fun at Sam's miserable brick of a track phone. Truer friends there never was. Then it hit him. He suddenly realized what was so different about Merry and Pippin. They were black. Not brown, nor tanned, nor chestnut, but capital B black. It was funny, because you would think he might have noticed something like that before now. Had Merry and Pippin always been black? The both of them? Frodo couldn't be sure. In any case, he dare not ask. He wasn't racist. Besides, it was good to have black friends. There would have been something gauche about too many white hobbits all in the same place. "Did you hear?" said Merry. "Hear what?" said Sam. Merry waved the hobbits closer together, and his voice took on a low, conspiratorial tone. "There's been talk of unionising." "Unionising?" said Sam, his voice full of hushed reverence. "That's right," continued Merry. "What with Boromir dying and all, there's folks saying enough is enough, that a union is the way to go." Pippin nodded. "Aye, by ourselves there's nothing we can do if we get hurt, or if they stick us with long hours and no break. But together," Pippin knit his fingers together, "together we can stick up for ourselves." "I don't know." Frodo ducked to his old Toby. He'd thought about it, of course, unionising, but the whole idea worried him too. It seemed to him forming a union might be just as liable to have the opposite effect of what they'd intended. That, in going after better for the job, the warehouse could just as easily cut them loose altogether, that it would wind up with them having no job at all. Frodo told the other hobbits as much, to which they nodded and contemplated. "But that's just the thing," said Pippin. "They can't just fire all of us. They need us, see? They need us just as much as we need them." Said Frodo. It was certainly something to think about. The hobbits went on in hushed voices about the possibility of them unionising, until eventually Wormtongue appeared from around the corner. Wormtongue was fairly new yet, but already had a reputation for being a very amicable and trustworthy fellow, a real straight shooter. He arrived pushing the limp dark hair back from his sweating, mayonnaise-coloured face and flashing a friendly, ingratiating smile to all the hobbits. He brushed a bit of stray packing material from his long, black cloak. "Did I hear someone say union?" He had a voice like congealing bacon grease. "That's right, you did," said Pippin, grinning. "You got a minute?" Merry and Pippin told Wormtongue all of what they'd told Sam and Frodo, with the same breakneck enthusiasm. The more of them they could get involved, the better. But once they were finished, Wormtongue seemed troubled, lost in a dark brooding. Pippin asked him what was the matter. Well, it's just... Wormtongue shook his head. He gathered his robes about him. Well, it's funny you should mention unions, because I'd just been reading this article. Here, from some dark hidden depths of his robes, Wormtongue produced a rumpled-up newspaper, a recent edition of the Washington Post, and handed it to the hobbits. He pointed to a headline in the business section. The Racist History of Labour Unions. Pippin was first to the article, and as he read it, a look of deep concern showed on his face. First Pippin, then Merry, then Sam, then Frodo. You see, said Wormtongue. Well, I'm sure unions are all well and good for some people, some of the time. Wormtongue picked up where the article left off, the hobbits nodding along to his every word. Frodo especially felt as if he'd narrowly dodged a Morgul blade. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to think he was racist. He looked over at Merry and Pippin. He certainly wouldn't want them to think he was racist. Had they always been black? They must have been, because neither Sam nor Wormtongue seemed to notice or mind. They had always been black, Frodo decided, and he wouldn't want them or anyone else to think he was racist. Frodo shook his head and came to as if from a trance. He handed Wormtongue back his newspaper. That'll be no union for me then, thank you very much. Nor me, said Merry. His eyes darted mistrustfully to Sam and Frodo. But wait, Pippin was the only one who seemed yet unconvinced. He looked about for some better answer writ on the faces of his companions. Come on, said Merry, his hand on Pippin's shoulder. Best get back on the road again. Pippin nodded, as if half asleep. Right, back on the road. Here, take it. Wormtongue handed Pippin his newspaper. The hobbit squinted at it. It really is a fascinating read. Merry led a weary Pippin back to the van and drove them away. Frodo and Sam waved them goodbye, and then when they turned around again, Wormtongue was gone. Come on, Mr. Frodo. Better get back to it ourselves. Frodo nodded. He imagined he could hear the overbearing ticking of a clock. The rest of the day passed by in relative routine, until at 8 p.m, when the moment finally arrived for Frodo's performance review. He took a moment to tidy himself up in the bathroom. He went by Sam, who gave him a hearty smile and a big Caucasian thumbs up. Gimli's office was small and almost bare, save the necessary furniture and a bit of affirmational signage on the wall behind him. Delve deeper, it said, below a picture of a happy dwarf and his pickaxe. Frodo had done his best to live by those words, and now it was finally going to pay off. Well, well, Frodo Baggins. Gimli shuffled his papers and smiled, his subtextually Jewish eyes peering down over his wire-rim spectacles. How do you like it here, laddie? Frodo smiled confidently. I like it very much, sir. Very much indeed. Aye, glad to hear it. Gimli finished with his papers and leaned back to better appraise the hobbit. So many of 'em, they come through and they're just not ready to work, or they thinks it's just a job like any other. Those are the ones I end up having to give 'em the axe. Frodo nodded. Not me, sir. I'm no slouch. Gimli slapped a thick calloused hand down on his desk. Good, laddie, good. Let's get down to business then. He took up his papers again and began to read aloud. Frodo Baggins, Hobbit, let's see here. Perfect attendance, good. Always on time, good. Always meets his quotas, good, good. Already Frodo was making plans to celebrate. He would treat himself to the Netflix plan without all the commercials. Just a month to start with, but after that, who knows? The sky was the limit. You've got the makings of a real Amazonian, Gimli continued. A real one. Not that there's not room for improvement, of course. Frodo nodded. Of course. We have gotten some complaints about incorrect orders, mostly improper packaging. As Gimli went on, Frodo nodded dutifully. And sure, maybe some of what he said could just as easily been the fault of the sorter or the driver or whoever else, but the hobbit accepted responsibility all the same. Before long, Gimli was finished and holding out his hand, encouraging Frodo to keep up the good work and to improve upon where he'd fallen short. In all that time, Frodo had not heard one word about a raise. From a deep stupor, and with a voice like an enfeebled old man, he finally managed to broach the subject. "A raise," said Gimli. He laughed and made jolly of it, but there was a twinge of annoyance in his voice too. "Maybe next time we'll see about a raise." But, Mr. Gimli... Afterward, Frodo wouldn't be able to recall exactly what he'd said in trying to justify himself. Such was the daze he was in. But whatever it was, it seemed to have certainly tested Gimli's patience. "Listen here," said the dwarf. "I like you, laddie. Really I do. But I've axed men for less complaining than you're doing now. You get your raise when I say you've earned it, and not a moment before. If in another 6 months I see you've improved on how you're doing now, then you'll get your raise, you understand?" Frodo nodded. "Yes, sir, I understand." Leaving Gimli's office, Frodo found himself going over the last 6 months in his head. Was it that his best just wasn't good enough? Had a life of reading and idle contemplation, listening to old Bilbo's tall tales, left him ill-equipped for the real world? Sure, it was just a quarter. That's what Sam was liable to tell him. "It's just a quarter, Mr. Frodo. That's not so terrible, is it?" "But it's my quarter," thought Frodo. "It was supposed to be mine. I'd earned it. Hadn't I earned it?" Frodo was so lost in his own miserable contemplation that he almost walked right out in front of a passing forklift. The driver slammed on the brakes. He cursed Frodo's not paying attention, his ineptitude. Frodo couldn't manage the words. He stood rooted in place, blocking the narrow path of the forklift and stammering, "Oi, like he'd forgotten what words were supposed to sound like. The fork driver barked. He cursed. Frodo couldn't seem to hear him. He didn't mean to be a bother, no more than he meant for the tears to come leaking from the corners of his eyes. 6 months of 12-hour days, pissing in empty bottles, and what had he to show for it? Nothing. Exactly nothing. Luckily, Sarah, the assistant floor manager, was nearby. Luckily, she recognized Frodo's episode, had seen it many times before, in fact, and hurried to intervene. Toto? She couldn't be expected to remember all the names. Toto Baggins? Frodo blinked. He came to. Frodo, ma'am. Frodo Baggins. Frodo, right. Are you okay? Do you need something? Yes, he did need something, but what it was exactly, he wasn't sure. Was it a raise? A day off? Did he have to piss? When he couldn't answer, Sarah smiled and lay a soft, warm hand on his shoulder. "Come," she said. "I know just what you need. Follow me." Frodo nodded and let himself be led away. He was but a piece of toilet paper clinging to her shoe. She could have been leading him to the fires of Mount Doom for all he knew, and he wouldn't have resisted or made a fuss. Instead, she shepherded him over to the other end of the factory, past sorting and returns, and over to where they'd recently installed a pair of new wellness chambers. There was one for the men and one for the hobbits. Each was about the general size and shape of a toilet stall. "Take some time for yourself." Sarah unlocked the chamber for hobbits and motioned Frodo inside. 10 minutes. Just relax, and by the time I come back, I'm sure you'll feel right as rain." Frodo nodded and was all but pushed into the chamber. The door slid shut behind him. He blinked and rubbed his eyes. Inside the chamber, the walls were a soft grey. The lights were low, and the only bit of furniture was a white lounge chair shaped something like a bean sprout. Frodo sat in the chair and tried to get comfortable. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do exactly, how the chamber was supposed to make him feel any better. It was cosy at least. It was quiet. Then the walls began to flicker, and the soft grey gave way to rolling green hillocks beneath a deep blue sky splotched with white puffy clouds. More than that, there was life here. There was Folko Boffin feeding his chickens. There was Celandine Brandybuck hanging the laundry out to dry. And there, good old Bag End, and good old Bilbo, as if he'd never left home at all. It was the Shire! The Shire, almost exactly as Frodo remembered it. Had Folko always been Latino? It was a miracle! That all the Shire, down to a blade of grass, could be conjured inside of this tiny box was a wonder and a miracle. Frodo even thought he could smell one of the old gaffer's pies cooling on the windowsill. He could smell the grass after the rain. Before he knew it, Frodo was weeping, silently at first, then with wild abandon. They were tears of joy, tears of sorrow, tears he hadn't even realised he'd spent months fighting back until they sprung unbidden from his eyes. Frodo stood and reached out to try and embrace his Shire more completely, to open the front door to Bag End and see how much might have changed since he was gone. But as he did, his touch was rebuffed by a flat warping of pixels. Frodo jerked back his hand and held it over his trembling mouth. That was all right. He didn't have to go any further than this. As long as he didn't move, as long as he didn't touch anything, then it was all as real as he wanted it to be. He was home again. He was a hobbit. At the end of his 10 minutes, which seemed the blink of an eye, the Shire melted away to a flaccid grey again, and the door to the wellness chamber opened. Frodo blinked and rubbed the tears from his eyes. There was Sarah, the assistant floor manager, standing there smiling. "How do you feel?" she asked. Frodo smiled. He choked back a sob. "Good," he said. "I feel really good." It was going on 8 o'clock, but a lemon-lime monster kept Frodo from succumbing to the evening slump. It was a good feeling, hitting his stride. His fingers flew like eagles over the bubble wrap. His eyes were like the eyes of elves as he affixed the labels. More rings. People were ordering more and more rings. Frodo packaged and sorted each one as lovingly as if they were his own, all of them precious. "Quitting time, Mr. Frodo." Frodo looked up from his work to find Samwise standing there with his backpack slung over his shoulder. Frodo scowled. "Oh, look what you've done, Sam. You made me lose my place." Samwise Gamgee wrung his nut-brown hands together. "Sorry, Mr. Frodo. I didn't mean to. Just thought you should know it's quitting time is all." Frodo ducked back to his work. "I'll be done as soon as I finish with these orders." "But the bus, Mr. Frodo. Don't want you to miss the bus." Miserable Sam and his miserable bus. Was that all he cared about? Was getting home at the end of each day? "I'll get the next one," said Frodo. "You go ahead and go on without me, Sam." "Well..." Sam fidgeted and scratched at his tightly curled afro. "Well, all right. See you tomorrow, then." "Right." Frodo barely looked up. "See you tomorrow, Sam." Sam was just about on his way when he stopped and turned back. "What about that raise you were hoping for, Mr. Frodo? Did you get your raise?" Frodo stopped and looked over his shoulder. He smiled, and his eyes were bright. "Next time, Sam. I'll get that raise next time for sure."